This is Basic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
And he looked at the screens. He said, "Well, those don't look like the test programs that we normally use." I said, "Well, they're not. I wrote my own. They're better than the other ones."
This is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Steve Cavin started at Cromenco, where he built computer kits and tested hardware. Later, he wrote several programs for the Atari 8-bit computers. Minotaur, which was published by Atari Program Exchange. It first appeared in the fall 1981 APX catalog. And the Atari versions of Juggles House and Juggles Rainbow, educational games published by the Learning Company. He also wrote The Five Letters, a hangman-style game that, so far, I haven't been able to find online. This interview took place on April 22nd, 2016.
In high school, I was a math whiz. And they ran out of classes for me to take. I took all my junior high school math and then all my high school math, and then they didn't have any more math for me to take. So I happened to be lucky enough to be in a high school that had a computer center. And the guy in charge of the computer center was one of the math teachers at the high school, gave me full run of the computer center. And convinced the administration that I should get credit for playing around with the computers.
Nice. So what year was this? What kind of computer?
That was 1973.
Okay.
I was 17 years old.
So we're talking punch card stuff at this point, or?
Yeah, it was. They had the old style teletypes, with the IBM spinning ball, and the teletype machines. And they also had 80-column card readers, card punch machines. So I did my Fortran work on punched cards, and I did my basic on the teletype, on the terminal.
Nice.
And that gave me a sort of a basic background in computer programming.
Okay. So how did you stumble across the Atari?
Well, I went away for 4 years and hitchhiked around the world.
Wow. Like
Yes.
Europe or where?
No, the whole world.
Wow.
Yeah, it took me 4 years, 2 years in North America and 2 years overseas. I just didn't believe that what I'd been told about the world could possibly be true, and so I decided to go see for myself.
Was it true?
No, it wasn't true. What it turned out was that just about everywhere I went, people were a lot like me. Which was not what I had been taught growing up in school.
Where did you grow up?
In the Midwest, Pontiac, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I got back. If you ever want to read the book, there's this book. I wrote a book called To Find Out.
To Find Out. Okay. Is that on Amazon and the usual places?
On Amazon, yeah. You can buy it for $10.
It's about that experience?
Yeah, it's about that experience hitchhiking around the world.
That sounds fascinating. I'm there. I'm going to read it.
All right. So I got back. I left home with $57 and a sweater, and I arrived home 4 years later with $11 and a Chinese fiance.
What happened to the sweater?
And we went home to Michigan and got married, and I was working in Michigan as a stock boy in a department store, and I decided that I talked to my old math teacher, and he said, "You're wasting your time here, Steve. You really ought to go out to the Bay Area." He was a Berkeley graduate, so he said, "You ought to go out to the Bay Area. They're doing something called microcomputers." He said, "I don't know what they are, but you'd be great." So I packed up my wife and all my belongings in the back of a Pontiac Le Mans, and just got in the car. In February of '79, and just drove out to Silicon Valley. When I got out there, I started driving up and down Central Expressway, looking at all the computer stores or computer factories, and I went down the El Camino and found a computer store called the Digital Deli and they were selling microcomputers. They were selling Cromenco microcomputers at the time. And I asked if Cromenco was a local company. They said yes. And I went and got a job there. And it was kind of interesting. I don't know how much time you have for this.
I have all the time that you have. I want to hear the story.
I went in there, and the VP of HR was the founder's wife. And she said, well, do you have a degree in computer science? And I said, no. And she said, well, do you have experience working as a technician? I said, no. She said, well, what makes you think that you could work here at the computer factory? I said, well, what do I have to know? She said, well, you have to know component identification, component values, and soldering. I said, I'll come back in a week. She said, you can't learn that in a week. I said, I'll come back in a week. So I went back to San Francisco. I was living in Chinatown at the time. And I got a book on computer components and identification and a book on soldering, and studied the books, and then went back a week later, and I said, I'm ready. She says, what, ready for what? I said, well, I'm ready to take the test. And she said, well, you couldn't. I said, are you going to give me the test or not? She said, okay. So she reaches into the drawer and pulls out a handful of components and throws them on the desk. So what's that? I said, well, that's a resistor. I said, well, she said, what's that? That's a capacitor. And she said, what's that? I said, that's a diode, and the anode is the side with the silver band on it. She said, all right, how about this resistor? I said, that's a 120K resistor. She said, well, you couldn't possibly have learned soldering in a week. Let's go out on the floor. So they went out on the factory floor. In those days, in the early 80s, the computers were Z80 and 8080 based computers. And they built them right there on the factory floor. They had teams of Vietnamese immigrants with little shower caps on, soldering away. And I went to the soldering area, and they sat me down. And the foreman was a Mexican lady, and she didn't like the HR lady at all. And so when she sat me down, she bent down and she whispered in my ear, "Don't worry, it'll be all right." And I sat down and I soldered a whole line of memory chips into a circuit board. I doubt whether any of the soldering connections were any good, but she turned to the HR VP and said, "Yep, he'll do."
Wow.
And that's
so had you soldered before, or had you only read about it?
I just read about it.
That's great.
I read that I read heat, solder, heat, and so that's what I knew, right? So they looked like soldered joints anyway.
Right. So you were hired as a factory tech. What was your job?
Yeah, I was hired to count 28 resistors and put them in a little plastic bag. That was my job.
Wow.
At that time, Cromenco was Z80 based, and they were selling Cromenco computers, but they were also selling kits. You may remember those days. There were radio kits like Heathkit.
Sure. Yeah.
And so Cromenco sold kits to build Cromenco computers, and my job was to make kits.
Wow. So
I quickly progressed to cable harness, and from there I progressed to doing the test tech. And finally, I got to a part of the company where they had an actual computer that I was testing printers and terminals. And I would work all day testing printers and terminals, and then I would stay after and write test programs in Z80 assembly language. And so I learned Z80 assembly language, and I rewrote all the tests in my area, and then printed them out and left them on the shelf in my area. And one day the founder of the company came through, and he said, "Well, who are you?" I said, "Well, I'm Steve Cavin." He says, "What do you do here?" I said, "Well, I test printers and terminals." And he looked at the screens. He said, "Well, those don't look like the test programs that we normally use." I said, "Well, they're not. I wrote my own." He said, "You wrote your own test programs?" I said, "Yeah, they're better than the other ones. They give a better alignment." he said, "Do you have any listings?" And I reached over to the shelf and said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do." And I gave them to him. And about 3 days later, a programmer from the programming group came over and said, "Would you like a job as a junior programmer?" And I said, "I'd love it." And so I got a job programming Z80 microcomputers for the RPG-2 language. So we're almost to the point where I encounter Atari now.
Okay.
So in the course of 2 years, I went from a kid from Michigan with a high school education who happened to know a little bit about programming computers to a junior programmer. And while I was at Cromenco, I met a guy who was friends with Ann Pystrup, who founded the Advanced Learning Techniques, which later became the Learning Company, which was a big name in computer software for children.
Right.
Anyway, he introduced me to Ann Pystrup, and he told Ann Pystrup that I knew something about computers. About the same time, the Atari 800 came out, and I was very interested in doing my own company, and here was my chance to buy a computer that I could actually afford. So I borrowed $10,000 from my friend and bought an Atari 800 and a couple of disk drives, and took them home and started programming games.
Wow.
At that time, the Atari 800 had superior sound and graphics. They were much, much better than the Apple II. The resolution of the Atari had multiple graphics modes,
right,
and so it enabled me to make much nicer images.
So I don't want to spoil the ending here, but did you make your $10,000 investment back in selling software? Because yikes, that's a lot of money in Canadian dollars.
I just did. What happened was I wrote a few games. I wrote the Minotaur, and I wrote the Five Letters, and a few other. I was working on a game that would map the night sky so that you could look at your Atari computer and see whichever stars that you saw and map, and then walk outside and see them up in the sky. But I never finished it. About that time, I was introduced, like I said, to Ann Pystrup, and she introduced me to Leslie Grimm, who was the Apple II graphics programmer for their game software. And they asked me if I could program the Atari computer, and I said yes, I could. I had learned to program it in BASIC originally, but they had a whole binder with screenshots, screen layouts for actually on graph paper with the actual pixels drawn in. And because the graphics on the Apple were they were like 16-bit graphics, and they were really primitive. I mean, I think
16 color graphics.
16 color graphics. Sorry, yeah. 16 color graphics. Yeah. And the graphics were so low resolution that you could actually draw an Apple screen on a piece of graph paper. So I looked at the graphics, and I said, we could do much better than this on the Atari. And they said, really? And I said, yes. But I'm going to have to you go to assembly language in order to take advantage of these additional features. And they said, can you do that? And I said, of course. So I got a book on 6502 assembly language.
So you already knew Z80 or something assembly, right?
I already knew Z80 assembly language.
Right.
So learning a new assembly language was not that much of a challenge. I went down to Atari, which at the time was in the Golden Triangle. Atari was over on Borregas Avenue in Sunnyvale. And I went over there and bought it for, I think it was for $20 or $25. They had the entire operating system for the Atari in a binder,
Right.
A 3-ring binder called the Calling Disk Operating System, or CDOS. And so I bought the Calling Disk Operating System and took it home. And what it really was essentially was an assembly language dump of the PROM part of the Atari 800, the upper 16K.
Right.
This is a 48K machine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
64K machine, but the upper 16 was where the operating system resided. And I began by learning by going through the listings, and by staying up late at night and seeing what happened. I'm doing lots of peeks and pokes. I eventually learned how to use the Antic graphics and the sound generators, and was able to produce really flashy graphics for the Atari 800.
Nice. So Juggles, which came first, Juggles Rainbow or Juggles House?
Let's see. I think Juggles Rainbow was first.
Okay. So that was you were porting it from the Apple. I mean, it was already an Apple game, and then you translated it?
It was already an Apple product.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it wasn't an Apple product. It was for the Apple.
Right.
It was an ALT product. The learning company hadn't come along and bought them yet. And I didn't use it wasn't a port of the source, even though the Apple was also 6502. But the original Juggles House and Juggles Rainbow were written in BASIC for the Apple II. And so what I did was I took the storyboards and rebuilt it from scratch.
Cool. Were those products you paid a flat fee, or was there royalties? Do you remember?
Yeah, I was originally promised 50% of all of the proceeds from the product, but when the company was acquired and changed its name to the learning company, all I had was a handshake agreement, and the new corporate buyers said that didn't matter. So I ended up with my percentage got negotiated down from 50% of the proceeds to 10% of the learning company's proceeds, which was only 8% of the actual proceeds. So I got 0.8% of all the profits from Juggles Rainbow and Juggles House, which came to about $12,000.
Wow. That must have been disappointing.
Well, yeah. I had kind of hoped that I would, in those days, though, you have to understand, Kevin, we weren't as money hungry as people are today. We were kind of jazzed that we were building really cool stuff, and so I was just as excited about building cool software for kids as I was, the money aspect of it. So it didn't really bother me all that much.
Those programs sold pretty well, didn't they?
Yeah, Juggles Rainbow and Juggles House sold very well. And I believe that they did a follow-on called Juggles Boots, but I'm not sure.
All right, so did the Minotaur come before or after the Juggles stuff, or at the same time?
The Minotaur came before. Okay. It was a really interesting... At that time, things were being invented daily. And so entrepreneurs who wanted to program for the Atari 800 we actually, when I first bought my Atari 800, they didn't even have disk drives yet. It was about a year, I believe, until disk drives came out for the Atari 800. So in the meantime, we had a cassette tape drive that you had to put your programs on, and my programs for Juggles Rainbow and Juggles House were so large that what I had to do was do overlays, because the entire program wouldn't fit on the computer at one time. So I would, depending on what part of the game you were at, I would load that part of the game off the cassette tape, and then when you got to the next part of the game, I would load that part of the game over top of the previous part of the game, because the whole game wouldn't fit in memory at one time. But the idea was, for entrepreneurs, was I started making, when discs became available, I started making discs. Before that, I made cassettes, and I did my own graphics, and made stickers to, like, labels, for the media, and then made a user's manual, and put the user's manual and the tapes or discs in a Ziploc bag, and put them, and then took them down to Computerland and Microage, and put them out on the shelf on consignment.
And which programs were these?
That was the 5 letters and the Minotaur.
Okay, so the 5 letters, I can't find any reference to that online at all.
Oh, it wasn't as popular. The Minotaur was really the one that I thought that it was that was good. That was really worthwhile.
So what is the 5 letters?
The 5 letters was just a glorified hangman. You had 5 spaces, and you guessed, and it would tell you if you got the letters right, and it would fill them in.
And this was in BASIC?
The 5 letters was in BASIC, and the Minotaur was in BASIC.
Do you still have a copy of the 5 letters? Because it doesn't exist on the internet.
No, I don't think so.
It's too bad. Did you submit the 5 letters to Atari Program Exchange as well?
I don't remember.
Okay. So you were selling Minotaur direct in baggies, and then at some point you must have decided to submit it to APX. Can you tell me about that?
Well, I was a young guy, and I was feeling very entrepreneurial, and I had already done my own product. I did a programming in BASIC program for a guy who fixed organs, electric organs, for a living, and he needed a database to keep track of all of his customers, and I made a configurable database for him, and so I already had some experience of doing my own thing. So what I did was I was at that time, Atari was very transparent in terms of letting their users know what was coming out and what was available, and also the Microage manager of the store was very helpful in encouraging me to go and see what was available out there. And then the Atari Program Exchange came out. I thought, well, this is my chance to get my program out there where people can buy it. So I went ahead and filled out the forms and sent in the media.
Nice. I played it this morning. The game is, once you finally get to start playing the game, it's fun, but it's slow. It's slow to start up. It generates the maze. It really takes a long time. I think you became a better programmer as you learned assembly language and things.
Yeah. Yeah, the Minotaur was my very first attempt at writing a computer game.
Nice. Do you remember getting any feedback from the folks at APX about things they wanted changed or anything?
Well, no, I don't remember what they said. They said that they thought it was really cool that it generated a fresh maze every time. That took a little bit of algorithmic savvy to figure out how to do that. And they asked if there was a way to get the Minotaur to be something other than just a white cursor. Because could it be be a little animal? And I admitted that I didn't know how to do that.
How did it sell?
Well, it didn't make me rich. It sold pretty well. I had I think five computer stores in the South Bay. Computer was it Comp
USA? No, it's before then.
That's much later. Computerland maybe, and the Byte Shop, and Micro Age, I think were the three that I had stock in. And I would go by about once a week and look at the shelves and see if any had sold, and collect my consignment royalty, and restock the shelves. When I was kind of discouraged that I didn't sell faster, didn't sell more copies, because I thought it was a pretty good game at the time. Because you have to translate all this back to the years of early '80s when Pong was still a big deal. There just weren't that many games available for the Atari 800.
Sure.
I think what happened that really hurt me was that the Atari disk drives were somewhat unreliable. They were individual drives that you bought separately from the computer itself, and they would fail. They would get out of alignment and fail. And Atari wasn't very good about providing support for their hardware. So people started moving away from Atari and moving towards the Apple II because the support was better for the product.
And so is that what you did? Because I don't see you didn't make any other software than what we've talked about. So why did you move away from the Atari?
Well, I got swept up in Juggles Rainbow and Juggles House move. And that took me, I think that must have taken 2 years to get both of those games out. And I didn't have, I was working as a software engineer and doing my Atari programming on my own time. So I didn't have enough time to do any other games. And then by the time I got done with Juggles Rainbow and Juggles House, the Atari 800 had faded in terms of popularity, and I didn't continue anymore.
So I didn't realize that those were side projects after work.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was working on a Z80 based microcomputer company called Dynabyte, and another one called Molecular Computer during that time.
Wow. So
I'd work, 10 hours a day as a Z80 microcomputer programmer, writing drivers mostly. And then I'd go home and my baby son would crawl across the floor and hold on and tug on my leg while I was sitting at this desk programming Juggles Rainbow and Juggles House.
Wow. What haven't I asked you about those days that I should have?
Oh, well, the thing that I wanted to get across to you, which I don't think we really touched on enough, was just how playful the atmosphere was at that time. It's indicative of the period that both Steve Jobs and Bill Gates didn't have any formal education either. Most of us didn't. Most of the really serious programmers were young hippies who thought the computers were neat and they figured they could program them. And we were programming them in a kind of a free-spirited playful way. We would build stuff because we thought it was cool. We wanted to see if we could build it. It was a really heady time where people were laughing and playing a lot, as well as working. And the work environment was a really playful place where people were just coming up with stuff. You'd walk down the hall and say to someone, "Hey, I just built this thing," and you'd show it to them, and they get excited, and you'd go back to your office, and the next day they'd come into your office with something completely new that they had built on top of what you built, and they'd say, "Hey, look at this," and I'd go, "Oh yeah," and then I would build something, and so on. And so it was really a playful time in the history of Silicon Valley.
Must have been fun.
It was really great. We all thought we were going to be rich, and we all thought we were going to have a hell of a good time. And we did have a hell of a good time, and a few people did get rich.
Cool. I think I have what I need, Steve.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.